spit bottle one time.
Okay, let's get into this test here and get it done so we can get out of the shop and do real work. An electronically controlled automatic, this is automatic transmission test. We've already done a couple of tests, but I'm going to call this automatic transmission test 1. You know, we did one last week on pressure testing, and we did one before that on basic stuff, just a basic knowledge test. But right now we're going to start out with some true-false questions on automatic transmission test 1. An electronically controlled automatic transmission uses complex hydraulic system to regulate shift timing. The answer they're wanting you to give there is false, because by and large, when they first started coming out with electronic transmissions, they actually were able to make smaller valve bodies with not as many valves in them because they were using electronics. Well, things have kind of gone the other way, because I mean, if you looked at the valve body on the Taurus that Daniel and Abby are working on, that doggone thing's complicated.
I thought it would be that it was shift solenoids that made it shift.
Well, they are, but the shift solenoids are basically going to block fluid flow and move valves. You get where I'm going with that? I mean, that's how that operates. And I'm gonna whip through this pretty fast because I'm going to show you all a little dab of video on planetary gear sets, okay? And all that. Okay, a continuously variable transmission allows the engine to stay within its power band. And that is true. That's one of the benefits, and that's what they're wanting to do now more and more with transmissions. That's why a lot of the transmissions, you'll notice, if you've been keeping up with it, the transmissions have more and more gears. You know, they got more gears than they've ever had before. You know, they keep adding more and more gears, 6 speeds and all this kind of stuff. And what they're wanting to do is they want to keep it in its power band. And what a power band is, if you look at a graph of an engine, it starts out, if you draw a graph like that, the horsepower goes up, and then when it hits about 3,500, it starts to go down. So even you got more RPM, but your power, you're losing some of your power. So basically, and this is sort of this is not all engines. This is just me talking about the basic, you know, concept of a power band. You want to keep your engine spinning at about this RPM all the way up. You start off in your low gear, you're going to go up. And you might even notice your tach on an automatic transmission. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And finally, when you get up to your highest gear, you're usually driving along at about 1300 RPM going down the highway. Of course, you're not needing a lot of power there, you're wanting mileage, but whenever you keep it in its power band the optimal amount of time, you're going to have more efficiency, better gas mileage, and all that kind of stuff. That's why you get so many gears, and that's why a continuously variable transmission is like that. And I was telling Daniel yesterday, how many of you have set your cruise control and got disgusted when you started up a hill and it downshifted? You know what I'm saying? You really don't like that, do you? Well, Chrysler years ago came out with something called fuzzy logic in their powertrain control module on some of their cars, and what they would do is they would say, even though the throttle angle and the load was such that it should have downshifted, the engine controller knew that the cruise control was engaged, and it would keep it from downshifting because it knew you wouldn't like it. That was called fuzzy logic, is what they call it, is what Chrysler called it, you know. Transverse mountings are used primarily on rear-wheel drive vehicles in which the engine is mounted side to side. Now that's a bunch of hooey. What we talk about on a car, if the engine is sitting in here this way, we call that's transverse mounted. We're also going to call that east-west orientation. You get me? If the engine is mounted this way, and you got rear-wheel drive, you're going to call that north-south orientation, or a linear mounted engine. Okay, there are some vehicles that have. How many of you guys can think of a car with an engine that's mounted this way that is driven by the front wheels? You know of a car like that? A front-wheel drive car where the engine is mounted straight. Can you think of one? Huh? There's quite a few. You remember your little Eagle Visions and your, the right in the early 90s? Also, Acura Vigor was a strange little car back in the early 90s, and they had the engine. Some of your cars that Volkswagen and Audi make, the Volkswagen Quantum and the Audi, Audi Fox or whatever it was. Some of them that had a 5-cylinder engine in them would be mounted this way. And so just because Cadillacs were like that back in the 80s, Eldorados, they had front-wheel drive and the engine was mounted this way. So what I'm saying is just because it's got front-wheel drive doesn't mean the engine's always going to be sideways, although usually it is. Because it's a little easier to do the gearing if you got the engine up one way or another. Toronados, we're like that.
Definitely going to be false.
Yeah. So, well, basically, let me make sure that you got there. That is, yeah, that's basically a false. That one was totally wrong. And longitudinal mounting, which is the other waist, you know, the transmission or transaxle is mounted front to back, and that's true. Although the composition of automatic transmission fluid has changed over the years, most automatic transmission fluids can be used on all vehicles. That is totally false. You're not going to do that. You got to be patient. You got to make sure that you understand. This is one of the things that I thought was kind of comical. One of my graduates was working at a place where they sold used cars. It was a nice used car place, and he actually got a crate transmission from Ford and put in a Windstar, and he popped it in there pretty quick. You know, he could get it out and get it back in pretty fast. And so when he got it put in there, it came with the fluid in it. So basically, all he had to do was put it in, fire it up, pull the dipstick, make sure it had plenty in it, and drive it out the door. And it was fine for a while. Okay, that's important. So listen to what I'm telling you. So it came back and it was doing some, you know, surging and cutting up and stuff that was transmission related. And he called me and says, "What should I do about this?" I said, "Well, to begin with, you bought that thing from Ford. So you need to send it over to the Ford place and let Jimmy look at it. You know, because Jimmy was another one of my graduates who was working at the Ford place." And so this is going to sound peculiar until you know, till you get where I'm going with this. I said, Jimmy said, "It has the wrong fluid in it. It came from Ford with the wrong fluid in the transmission." And I said, "How did you know that?" Just, you know, off the top of my head, I did without thinking about it. He said, "I could smell it and tell it wasn't the right fluid." Well, the thing about it is, and I had that, where that little bottle of stuff? I'm going to pass this around and I want everybody to smell of it. This right here is friction modifier, right? This friction modifier. So when you smell this, it has the transmission fluid for the ones that have a torque converter that's not a, you know, the torque converters used to just be a straight lockup, where you had a straight lockup from the engine all the way through. Now they sort of graduate. They've been, since about 1989, various automakers will make it where you've got percentages of lockup all the way to 100%. It'll start out with 10, 20, 30, 40, and your scan tool will show you that. Well, whenever it's supposed to be partially slipping and not completely locked, if you don't have friction modifier that's built into the fluid, it'll make it surge, or on those Crown Victorias, when the friction modifier wears out in there, it'll feel like you're running over those little strips right before you come to a stop sign. And all that really takes to fix that is a transmission service. You drain the fluid out and put fresh fluid in it. But anyway, take the cap off of this and smell it. Everybody smell it. I want you to get used to it. Even if you've smelled it before, smell it again. Because you're going to have that's a sort of a concentrated version of what's in that fluid that's got friction modifiers in it.
Isn't that why the manual transmission fluid and rear end fluid stink?
Yeah, but well, the rear end fluid, if it's limited slip, is going to have that in it. Right? Okay. Yeah, that's definitely, it's got a very distinctive smell to it, and you need to know. Yeah. All right. He waves some to his face. I noticed that. Whenever he smells of something, he holds it and does this. And you notice that? Instead of putting his nose right in there.
Biology class teaches you to
remember that. Yeah, remember that. Put the lid back on it, too. Make sure you put the lid back on it. You got it? Great stuff, huh? Okay.
God, that smells like what my mama cooked last night.
Yep. Yeah. All right.
I'm going to keep that to myself.
Yeah. All right. Tighten that up. All right, now, here. Just toss me that or whatever. It ain't gonna come apart. All right, that's some of that friction modifier stuff. And that's that Motorcraft friction modifier. And my buddy Donnie, whenever he was trying to play jokes on his partner over there, he would take some of his stuff and soak a rag with it and put it under his toolbox. It just stinked to high heaven. Had to hunt for that rag. That's like putting Catfish Charlie in somebody's tent, you know. All right. So right here we got is anybody here that hasn't smelled Catfish Charlie? If you take this and make it 1,000 times worse, Catfish Charlie smells like that. Okay, so don't use automatic transmission fluid. You know, use the right kind. Basically, that's what you're going to do there. A technician that orders transmission parts needs to know the model year of the car.
Sure.
That's a good plan. I would say that's you don't need to be, every time you order any parts, you need to know the year model. Don't walk into the parts room like this one guy I used to work with and say, "Well, I don't know what year model it is, I don't know what motor it's got in it, but I need such and such a part for it." You know, that was a joke they used to tell about that guy. Always know your stuff and have every number. If you got a number on the side of the transmission, it would be helpful even to get that. Petroleum-based automatic transmission fluids offer better durability under higher temperatures than synthetic ones, and that's false. You know, synthetic usually does better, just more expensive. Viscosity additives keeps the automatic transmission fluid from becoming too thick at low temperatures and too thin at high temperatures, and that is true. Automatic transmission fluid is usually dyed red.
True.
That is true. Common foot powder or a black light can be used for signing the front and source of ATF. I think I talked about that yesterday. You wet it, you paint it white with the Dr. Scholl's, and that oil's coming out of there. It's going to make a nice little stain there. Okay. Now you guys got 15 questions, is that right?
You read that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. There's also a matching part of this test that I didn't hit y'all with because it's matching. I don't really like matching questions. I mean they're okay, but it's just a kind of a pain to grade that. Which of the following is not a main function of an automatic transmission? A, it allows the driver to change vehicle direction. That sounds like a main function, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. B, it allows the engine to supply power and torque to the vehicle's drivetrain and drive wheels. C, it provides various gear ratios to ensure good engine performance and fuel economy. Or D, it provides for manual upshifts and downshifts.
Not automatic.
Yeah, it's automatic, isn't it? Now, we'll tell you this. On some of the transmissions, usually what will happen if you've got a transmission, particularly electronic transmission, that doesn't have any power feeding any of the solenoids, it basically takes off in one of the higher gears. But you can shift it into the lower gear and shift it manually ordinarily.
I got a question. Automatic transmission, they have a little paddle. You know what I'm talking about, little paddle shifts?
Yeah.
What would that be considered?
Well, that's basically this question right here is not going to apply to the special hot roddy ones, where you can just bump the thing up and down manually if you want to. So basically just, color that a specialty deal. Because some of them, they're going to have it where you can select your gear manually. So that's, like I say, this question here is more of a shotgun statement. But this one guy came to me one time, and he'd been working on this Jeep Cherokee, and he said, I had this transmission out, and I rebuilt it, and I made sure everything was like it was supposed to be, and it still takes off in high gear. You can shift it manually, but you can't get it to shift up through the gears. And on that Cherokee, there was a transmission controller, which was separate from the engine controller, up under the dash on the right side, right in front of the passenger's knees. And in that little wire harness going to that was a little 10-amp inline fuse. And if that fuse is blown, you can shift it manually, but it won't shift automatically. And he said he'd been working on it for 6 weeks. And I just pulled that thing out, and I said, that fuse is blown. And stuck another fuse in there, and it shifted right out. I mean, sometimes it's the simplest thing in the world. If you ever have one that's only taken off in high gear and you can shift it manually, and that's not true on every single vehicle, but if you ever got one that's taken off in high gear, always make sure, you might want to do your scan tool test, make sure that there's power going to the shift solenoids in the transmission. Like if you've got a fuse, a lot of times you'll just have a fuse that's feeding that. And if you'll find a blown fuse, it'll be causing you a transmission problem, and you can have somebody's this girl that was in here one time, named Alicia, she had a little Pontiac. And so she calls me up and she says, my transmission won't just, takes off in high gear and it won't hardly shift and all that. And me and my dad was trying to figure it out because she was trying to come to school, because she was enrolled in here. And I said, check the fuses. And so she says, okay. So she hung up the phone. And when she came up here, she said, we fixed it. And I said, what did you find? She said, a blown fuse. She said, but when you first told me to check the fuses, my daddy said that was the dumbest fool thing he'd ever heard of. But when she found that blown fuse, put it in there. This is what we do. This is what we like to do. We do what's cheap and easy. You got me? If it's cheap and easy, that's what we do first. If it's, you don't want to put the most expensive repair in the most aggravating. Like this guy rebuilt the transmission and found out he had a blown fuse. You get where I'm going with that? Mm-hmm. You don't want to go there. That's kind of silly. Because you spend a lot of somebody's money. I guarantee he charged them for rebuilding that transmission. Of course, he rebuilt it, but did it really need that? You see what I'm saying? You want to be able to sleep at night.
So there was a tag that said transmission fuse or something?
Well, actually, you had to know it was there. But if you knew where the transmission computer was, there's an inline fuse, and everybody who worked on very many Jeeps knew about it. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I don't even remember how I found out about it, but I mean, there's a little. It's easy to see if you just pull that harness out. There it is. And he never even investigated it. He just assumed there was something wrong inside the transmission. You see? Hey, George.
Hey.
What's on
Thank you.
Huh?
There evening.
I tell him I cannot come over there until I'm through this. Okay, right. I'll be there in a little bit. Okay. All right. Let me see here. Let me see. Where we are. So manual upshifts and downshifts, no. Blank determines the power band.
All of the above?
Yeah, it's going to be all of the above on that one. The engine camshaft profile, air and fuel delivery, cylinder head design, Okay, number 13. A blank transmission control shift point timing through signals from a computer, and that's not rocket science. It's electronically controlled, right? And we got 14 and 15 here, the last two of those, and then I'm going to throw a video in here real quick for y'all to look at some planetary gear set stuff, which you really need to see. Really important. Number 14. Which of the following is not a method of correctly identifying the transaxle or transmission?
Fluid pan shapes.
That would be 14. Well, think about it. You got 14 is basically going to be mounting configuration. If you just say that it's longitudinal, that ain't going to tell anybody nothing. But look at that chart up there, Daniel.
Well,
Look, see? What are you seeing up there? I'm seeing fluid pan shapes.
Yeah.
And that's how you're identifying them, right? That's a 2000 model chart, but transmission and kit identification, passenger cars and light trucks, and it gives you all your, your General Motors and your Ford and your imports. You look at the shape of that pan and the shape of that filter, you know what you got a lot of the time. And a lot of the, you'll see a lot of the shops where they do regular transmission services that have that. Okay, number 15, a seal ring that requires special installation tools is what?
I want to see.
See?
15, that's going to be, That's going to be A.
Seal.
Hey,
That's going to be a solid one. A lot of these things are be like a real hard Teflon seal, and when you hold it in your hand, you're saying, man, how can I get that on there? Because that is really tough stuff. Okay. Now then, I'm going to close out this video, and I'm going to show you all the planetary gear.